Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.
Marking the 10th anniversary of the end of combat operations in Afghanistan and 3 years since the evacuation of Kabul. This series brings us personal accounts of those who were there. Just over 150,000 UK Armed Forces personnel served in Afghanistan. These true life experiences have been difficult to talk about. They tackle challenging issues and may be emotionally difficult to hear. If you feel you may be sensitive to this, you may prefer not to listen.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air. I'm Steve Bomford, co-founder of Company of Makers.
And I'm Tip Cullen, an actor and former Royal Marines Commando.
In this episode, we talk to Nick Denning, who served in the Royal Anglian Regiment. And I think this will give us a bit of an insight into life in Helmand Province.
Yes, Steve. Nick being a platoon commander, hopefully our listeners will get the insight into the tempo, the highs, the lows. I'm looking forward to hearing this.
Yeah, highs and lows indeed. Nick, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Pleasure. Good to see you again, Steve.
And you. So we're here to talk about Afghanistan. What were your experiences like in Afghan? Where would you like to start the story?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, an expansive question. I can only start at the beginning, really. I was in Afghanistan as a very new platoon commander in the Royal Anglian Regiment, the 1st Battalion, known as the Vikings. I was just over 3 months out of Sandhurst when I joined the regiment after the platoon commander's battle course, and immediately was on long exercises on Salisbury Plain, and then in Kenya with very few weeks off in between. And then I believe it was late March, perhaps the 23rd, I landed with the advance party in Camp Bastion. And within a sort of 3 days of what we call RSOI training, just getting your weapons zeroed, some in theatre procedures and all the rest of it, I was flown out to Nauzad in northwest Helmand Province to meet Lima Company 4-2 Commando, who were patrolling out there at the time, and to take an extended handover before my soldiers flew out. I think they joined me on the 30th. So it was all a very rapid sort of flash to bang experience getting there. I was very lucky to be a platoon commander of one platoon, A Company, 1st Battalion, Royal Anglian Regiment. And they were called Almanza Platoon. Every platoon in A Company was named after a battle honour from the distant past. And we deployed with 28 soldiers, me, my platoon sergeant and 3 fort corporals who were the section commanders of the 3 sections in my platoon. I knew from the start I had a very, very strong command team, seasoned and very bombastic and popular platoon sergeant and 3 very dedicated junior NCOs in those 4 corporals. Each of them very different, and each of them very influential sort of upon me. You know, you turn up as a young officer, you feel very wet behind the ears. You come out of Sandhurst feeling proud of yourself, I suppose, and then you get to battalion, you realize, well, you sort of feel like a boy in a man's world for a little bit, and you want to feel worn in and seasoned and up to speed as quickly as you can. So yeah, the training, getting ready for the tour was serious business and was very rigorously prepared and very physical. And then you sort of you get out there and you wait for your first patrol, your first contact with the enemy, your first engagement with the local nationals, and sort of the opportunity to come to grips with this counter-insurgency that the UK had selected to take part in. So there was a lot going on right from the start, and it was a very, I can probably say I've never been busier, than that sort of initial period of my life in the regiment.
Did that put extra pressure on you being so freshly out of Sandhurst? I mean, you come from a military background, am I right in saying?
Yes. Yeah, my father was in the infantry, and I have an older brother who's only just left the cavalry, having retired, and I had a real sense that this was my chance to do some of the things my family had done, and beyond my family, people that I really respected, and I obviously really respected the British military tradition, and I wanted to be part of that. And then, all of a sudden you're there with people to look after, operations to complete, and beyond the patrolling and the planning and the offensive operations that were to come. There's the never-ending real challenge of platoon command, which is holding together a team. And like I said, I was given a very strong team, but also for the private soldiers, a very young team, the youngest platoon in the company. And you work incredibly hard, and sort of you go through a lot of introspection, thinking, am I doing the best I can by these troops? Am I paying enough attention? Am I watching and seeing what's going on in the platoon? Do I understand the atmospherics, and do I understand the needs? And there was just this huge sense of, this is it, and don't mess up, and don't let the guys down. That was the main pressure, I would say.
Well, lives depend on it, don't they?
Yes. There's obviously a lot of danger fighting in Helmand, and we were quite a lucky platoon in a sense. We had one guy hit by a Taliban bullet. We had others who had a lot of close scrapes, but we were far luckier than other platoons out there. We had our fair share of the fighting. A lot of the we sustained a lot of the company's contacts with the Taliban, and the team performed well. Yeah, there is a sense of if I mess up, it's a multiple hit of disappointment for those that have been put through a bad plan and been thrust into danger, de minima, before you even and a lot of the time you think that's often the first thing on your mind is just being at home to some sort of colossal screw up that makes the team feel, wow, the boss doesn't have control, or something like that. This person is taking us into danger unprepared. That's the kind of, for me, that was always the most immediate fear. I suppose at the time I've thought less about, or tried to think less about, the idea that we might lose someone or have someone grievously wounded. I think after our first firefight, that was more of a pressing concern, because a soldier was lost by the wider company in 3 platoon. At that point I did begin to wonder whether we might have a similar situation. Thank God, we didn't. And that sort of feeling carried through right to the end of the tour. And I remember in the second half, that there would always be a lot of gossip around the rifle company as to whether or not we'd go to Musa Qala, which was in Taliban hands at the time. Would there be a battle group or brigade offensive operation to go and take that back? And the guys were always asking, are we going to do Musa Qala? And, what are we going to do? What are we not going to do? and especially as you get within the last sort of 6 weeks before coming home. I remember saying in my orders before patrols and before operations fairly routinely, look, there's nothing written down anywhere that says we need to sustain a hit at this point. It's not necessarily going to happen because we're near the end. So just keep doing what you're doing and keep sticking it all over them, because you've done a hell of a job so far. So those probably weren't my exact words, but that's the sort of sentiment I was using at the time.
Yeah.
Just to keep the guys thinking, it's not written down anywhere that anything like that's going to happen. But yeah, there was a sense of fear around that, which is only natural.
I guess the more so, the closer you get to going home as well, of course. What were the key moments of this deployment, Nick?
So it was a tour of two halves, really. We spent the first third of it in Nauzad, like I said, northwestern Helmand, and the latter 2/3 in Sangin, which is, well, bang smack in the middle of the Helmand River as it runs through the province. Well, slightly more to the north and to the east. There's a big Y junction there on the River Helmand, that's where a lot of the opium trade had been done in recent history, and a higher populated area, and lots of things to take an interest in. So we did patrolling and counter-insurgency as a rifle company based in those two locations, and we also took part in a number of company level and battle group level and brigade level operations where a concerted, deliberate offensive was mounted at various points along the Helmand River, and up around Nauzad as well. So it was a patrolling life interspersed with bigger, deliberate operations.
So you mentioned that you lost a man in one of these actions. Would you like to go into a bit more detail about that? Because I imagine that was a particularly trying time for you.
It was 3 platoon who had that terrible outcome, and this was our first firefight with the Taliban. So like I said, we'd come into province in late March, early April, depending on whether you landed with advance party or not. And then soon after that, we conceived of and conducted our first company group operation, which was designed to clear an area of Nauzad where British forces hadn't been before, sort of northeast corner. I believe the area was called Sorkani part of Nauzad. And I always imagine it as a sort of a Christmas tree shaped, sort of delta dart shaped bit of conurbation that sticks out of the town to the northeast, surrounded to the south by very dense scrub, actually, and to the east and to the north of it's of open farmers' fields, and sort of 400 meters beyond that, more dense farmland. And I think we started at 5 a.m. on this wadi, which was our start line, and we cleared it from the base to the tip of it, which was not too much of a distance. I think it was about 1 kilometer, and we took a deliberate approach to that. We cleared buildings slowly and deliberately, as well as shipping containers and other areas of interest. We saw, evidence of recent occupation. I think there were some cooking fires that were still warm, pots and pans, the odd bit of drugs paraphernalia, and that sort of thing. We also had people who didn't seem to be going anywhere walking through our patrol and saying hello in a way that just really stood out, because there was really no one there. It was a ghost town. And all of the sort of Northern Ireland and Iraq vets in the platoon refer to that as dicking, which is common parlance in the military, which basically means we're being reconnoitered, spied upon, observed by by enemy in plain clothes, and there's nothing that we can do with them. So we were pretty sure that we were being dicked. And also there was some Taliban radio traffic that was being intercepted by our interpreters, and they were telling us what was being said, and they were reporting rough locations and all the rest of it. Nothing overly concerning. I would say there was a slight tension building as we went through, and then we got to the apex of this Sorkani Christmas tree, and really nothing had happened. I think we were getting on for about 8:15 in the morning by that point. So we'd taken the 3 hours patrolling through. When we got to the end, my platoon was at the point of it on the tip. 3 platoon were on the southern side of this Christmas tree on my right, and 2 platoon were behind us in reserve. And the direction that came from the company commander was to have a soak period, so get into covered positions there, observe, and just wait and see what the Taliban would do. If anything, would they report on us? Would they try and engage us, and all the rest of it? And we went into soak period, and 2 sections were occupying a rooftop. 1 section were observing to the north from a rooftop a little further back along where we'd come, pointing north. And 3 section, we decided to push out beyond our cover to behind a low wall, because in these compounds that we were occupying, there was, very little in the way of, these aren't rooms with a view. These compounds all have sort of 8 to 10 foot high sand walls around them, and you can't see much. We needed arcs. We wanted to see the ground in front of us. So we sort of projected 3 section forward. When we made the decision, I was on the radio to the company commander, and 3 section we put out didn't have their section commander because he was coming to join us from the 2nd Battalion, and he simply hadn't made it out yet. So platoon sergeant said, "I'll place him out there, boss, and come back." And I was like, "Yeah," and continued on my conversation with the company commander. And it was while he was out there placing them, and it's one of the greatest regrets of my life that I got my sort of platoon sergeant stranded out there with that section. But it was during that interlude that the Taliban engaged us, and it was a coordinated ambush with a lot of weapon systems in use. The Taliban were firing at us with a variety of small arms. At the time, we suspected a sort of a heavy machine gun as well, and we could hear RPGs and all the rest of it. And they gave us a good rate of fire for a sustained period. It was a hell of a noise. I remember I'd just been sitting with a mortar fire controller, a corporal, who I saw not long ago, actually, where I live in Guildford, and we were sat next to each other, and I'd just come off that radio conversation. I was waiting for platoon sergeant to come back, and he said to me, "Oh, do you know what, boss? It's boring, isn't it? This is going to be a really boring tour. These things always are. Iraq was boring. This is going to be boring. I'll tell you what was really interesting was Londonderry." And it was at that point, as he said Londonderry, it just kicked off. Mm-hmm. I've never heard anything like it. I think it took my brain 3 or 4 seconds that felt like an eternity to actually figure out what on earth was going on. I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a hell of a rate of fire, and it's them. We're under attack." So at that point, I grabbed the Pressel on my chest for my radio set and said, "Charlie 1, this is Bronze 10 Alpha, contact, wait out," which is voice procedure for saying, "Hello everyone, this is 1 platoon commander. We're under contact, wait out." And by saying that, you're asking everyone to get off the radio network to let you speak. Had to get forward and try and report on what was happening. And it was very difficult to ascertain the nature of the contact. I knew which way roughly the bullets were coming from. It was very hard to sort of stick your head around the corner and have a look, because we were under heavy fire. So sticking your head out around the corner was extremely dangerous. The rounds were very close. They were hitting the walls and all that sort of thing. 3 section, who we put out behind a low wall, really were pinned. They were in the killing area of the ambush. And And I remember the platoon sergeant, trying to call to me on the radio and describe where the enemy were, and he was saying sort of 70 to 100 meters, several enemy fighters, and he was so low on the ground that his boom microphone was pushed into his mouth, and it was very hard to understand him. So I was saying, so slow down, calm down, try and take your mic out of your mouth and keep reporting. And that's how it kicked off, really. And I remember making my way back to the company commander and sort of relaying what was happening, and very calm, professional atmosphere around with company headquarters. He was there with the JTAC, who's the person that queues up our air support and our mortar support and artillery support and all that sort of thing, offensive support. And he went, yeah, Nick, and my company commander went, Nick, you need to get back forward. We'll try and queue up some OS, and you try and organize some organic fire support, as in from within your own platoon, some covering fire, so that you can extract your section. I was like, okay, and ran back. I remember falling over pretty badly just for the hell of it. Just a bit of light relief, but yeah, finally got back to 2 section, and they had abandoned their rooftop position and crossed the road into a completely enclosed compound, and were covering arcs through doorways and that sort of thing. It was simply too dangerous for them to stay on that rooftop. They were overmatched by enemy fire, and quite rightly decided to get down. And then this firefight persisted, and we began to try and extricate ourselves. And then with regards to casualties, a little later on, it must have been about 20 minutes after the engagement had started. We had the terrible call over the radio. 3-0 Alpha, man down. So 3 platoon had someone shot, and that soldier was then extracted with his section commander, who'd been hit through the shoulder, and they were taken back to the rear of the company position, back to where a helicopter could pick up the private who'd sustained the gunshot wound. It seemed under his armpit, between his body armor plates, and he was taken away on the medical emergency response team, Chinook. And then 3 platoon recovered a bit, and offensive support was coming in. So by this point, I think we'd had a mortar fire mission. There were US F-15 jets on station, and I think 2 500-pounder bombs were dropped. And I remember, the time came for us to extract. I was told by the JTAC, I believe, that there would be one more mortar fire mission, and at the end of that, it was time to go. Not to go during it, because the rounds would be close to that front section, but at the end of it, it would be time to extract. And at that point, I worked with 2 section who were in that enclosed compound to try and arrange that organic fire support, and the only solution available was to get sort of 4 private soldiers on top of a very small rooftop, who at the appointed moment would sit up, and around just in front of this small rooftop was a very small parapet. We're talking sort of maybe 15 inches high, which they could lie behind and then eventually get up and engage. And when this mortar fire mission ended, and we got the word, without quite believing what I was asking for, it was kind of now, and these guys just dutifully got up and started giving the best rate of fire they could back to the enemy. As soon as they got up, the youngest man in the platoon had a splash. A round hit the parapet in front of him. Would have been going straight for his center of mass, but he just kept on firing. I've never been so impressed, really. And then after a few seconds, a long few seconds, it was probably about 30, but it felt like an age. I could see 3 section running past the doorway to the compound that we were in and back down the main road of the Sorkani Christmas tree back to where 2 platoon had set up an emergency rendezvous. And I counted all 8 of them past, and I couldn't believe how lucky we are. Lucky we were. It's quite hard to relate to you how oppressive the sound of the enemy fire was, and I can't imagine what it would have been like for them being down underneath it. And I can't believe those 4 guys sat up and did their job in the way that they did. I can believe it because they were great, but yeah, it must have been really something. So yeah, and other strange things happened too. Before that point, I'd had a couple of snipers sent up to me from behind, and they said, "Yeah, boss, 2 snipers." And I said, "See if you can get on one of these rooftops, see if you can get eyes on the enemy position, report and engage as best you can." And they went, "Okay, we'll look down here." Went down an alleyway, turn left, turn right, and the first of the 2 of them bumped chest to chest into a Taliban fighter, and shot him with his pistol, and they ran back and left a grenade behind. And I think they believe they got another in that. But the Taliban were trying to get behind us, so they were engaging us from the front, heavy fire, and they were trying to do a left flanking attack with poorly equipped, possibly coerced fighters with just 1 or 2 magazines each. And it was one of those groups that had bumped straight into 3 platoon, and that corporal and that private soldier that got wounded at that point. So they were just coming through in pairs and 5s and whatever. So two had penetrated, we believe, and run into those snipers, and 5 of them ran into 3 platoon at the front there. And that was why it was important for us to recover. That's why company command was saying, provide organic fire support and come back after this mortar fire mission. So we did. Got into the protected bubble of 2 platoons ERV, their emergency rendezvous, and then kept going. Picked up with 1 section who I said were sort of rear left on a rooftop facing north. They linked up with us. We had a bit of trouble finding each other, I think, at one point in the sort of maze of compounds. Headed back. They'd been firing to the north because the Taliban had deployed to the north of us as well, and were firing in to our position. So it really was a 3-sided. They'd selected their fight well, and were trying to encapsulate A Company. They're trying to wrap us up and assault us, and give us a really hard time. It was quite well executed, I thought, at the time. Put us under a lot of pressure. Certainly gives you a very dark feeling. And that emergency rendezvous, once we'd gone through it, 2 platoons ERV, they engaged Taliban who were following up. So it had become a bit of a fighting withdrawal. And then eventually we got back to the wadi where we'd started. Got the whole, we were there first, covered it. I realized at that point I'd long since finished all my water, sort of new platoon commander in Helmand Province, just drinking like no man's business. So I was getting a bit dehydrated. And then eventually 2 platoon came through, and we continued on our way back to what we call the DC, the district center, our base in Nauzad. We waited until everybody was in. We unloaded our weapons. We were all bouncing a bit. Everyone was full of adrenaline. And very promptly after that, the company commander called us together and said, I don't know quite how to tell you this, but Private Gray is dead. He died on the helicopter, and we need to process this now as a team, as a company, or words to that effect. And he also said that that was a great deal of pressure, and he was very proud to see that this team hadn't folded, and that we'd stood up and held our ground as best we could, and recovered in good order. So yeah, we'd made it back. There were other minor casualties in the company. One from a ricochet. Nobody knew where that had come from. In addition to the 2 guys from 3 platoon who'd been shot, so, up on my right flank. So yeah, and then that was the first and one of the worst contacts that A Company had on the tour. And that's where that sort of that fear I mentioned before came in. Like, oh yeah, maybe maybe it'll be us. It could just be a matter of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And that narrative of sort of, well, there's nothing written that it has to be any of us, sort of became quite important, and something that I thought of a lot. But yeah, that was the first contact, and very soon after that we were off on a battle group operation called Op Silicon.
Nick, before you go on to that, when you this first contact, as you put it, I mean, you're describing it very, very calmly, as I've no doubt you're trained to do at the time as well. But what was the impact of it on you and your platoon and the wider company? Of that contact, and obviously the loss of life.
Mixed. It wasn't as alarmed as I thought it might be. I think that, funnily enough, there was an awful lot of pride straight off the bat, because we'd just done something that we'd been preparing to do for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And and for better or for worse, we did want to take the fight to the Taliban, and we had projected where Brit 4 hadn't been before, to see what the Taliban were made of, and we got what we bargained for in that respect. I think in quieter moments, different emotions. So obviously, 3 Platoon Commander felt inclined to write a letter to the parents of the soldier we'd lost. Couple of soldiers came to speak to me one-to-one just to say, well, that was a hell of a thing, wasn't it? And just have a cigarette at nighttime. We, as platoon commanders, I remember sort of sitting with them and my platoon sergeant and just talking through the decisions we made, and sort of getting validation from each other that that we've done the right things. A bit of a sort of post-match review. And then there was a sense of just sort of, we did ask for this, so let's not get maudlin about it or anything like that. We need to crack on. The guys still had their sense of humor. I remember calling my oldest brother, who had done the first Gulf War, and he was in, and I sort of just waited a couple of nights, went, no, I really must call him, and sort of called him up and went, so here's a story of what's happened. We haven't been able to call for a while because when someone gets badly hurt or killed, they lock down the external communications so that the news doesn't get out from the wrong direction. Parents need to be told properly by the military before things make social media or whatever gossip network might exist. The papers, heaven forbid. So when I was able to called my brother and said, this is how it happened, and I think there's quite a good chance now that we'll lose someone from my platoon. There's a perfectly reasonable chance that it will be me. So this isn't going to be an easy 6 months. So just be ready to. I think I asked him to sort of be a bit of a leader in the family if the worst happened or something like that, and he was like, yeah, completely get it. So that was, and that sort of took a weight off somewhat.
Mm.
Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, it's all very contained. There's not much that's sort of let out. Everyone sort of lets the steam out gradually. Yeah, and I think that's the mark of a well-built company in a way.
Mm.
So we were ready for it. We'd had all of our lectures, and we knew what we'd asked for. We knew what this was. Yeah, and people did things their own way.
Yeah. So, as you were about to say, you were sent on a battle group. I think you were going to say operation.
Yeah. So we had a couple of these in the ensuing couple of months. So there was Operation Silicon, which was from the end of April, about 9 days, and then by the end of May we were off on another, which was called Last Day Kulang, which I think it's Pashto for pickaxe handle or pick helve or something like that. And that was the first week of June, end of May, first week of June, and those were similar in that we flew back to Camp Bastion, or drove back to Camp Bastion, and assembled. The battle group assembled with various supporting assets, drove off to assembly areas in the desert away from the Helmand River. For those that don't know the Helmand geography, it's an enormous desert with a big fertile river called the River Helmand running through it. And on the floodplain there, which is anything from a few hundred meters to 3 kilometers wide, depending on where you are, that's where all the farming happens. That's where all the opium is grown, and it's no surprise that that's where everybody is, and that's where the fighting happens. So you can assemble a large body of troops out in the desert and prepare to shake out into formation and conduct an offensive on a chosen section of the floodplain, and that's exactly what we did on a couple of occasions. Operation Silicon was sort of parallel 2-company advance along the river, and A company were on the high ground. We captured a village called you know what? I've forgotten it. It wasn't Habibola Calais, but up near Gereshk, up on the northern side of the river. Lots of small arms engagements, but particularly for B Company, who were down on the valley floor on our right. We had more sporadic engagements on the sort of the desert embankment coming off the floodplain. But that was an eventful sort of offensive operation that sort of culminated in us having an engagement with a large number of Taliban near what we suspected was a sort of headquarters location, and there was sort of a long range firefight involving the reconnaissance cars and other assets, which was deemed quite successful. And after that, we recovered to Nauzad, lived there for a bit longer. We had 2 or 3 more sort of company level operations that were typically quite punchy, where we'd sort of go out into the sort of open desert around Nauzad and try and get the Taliban to engage us in a position of our choosing. One which I believe was called Harlesden. Our company command element with the JTAC got really high up in a mountain location, so that when we got engaged, they'd snuck up there by night. They could locate the enemy firing points and queue up the support that we needed. And that worked well. And we got a sense by the end of our time in Nauzad that we were picking our fights very much unlike Friday the 13th, that first engagement back in April. We figured we had it down a bit. And I think there were a few of us that would have liked to have seen out the 7 months there to see if we could make a big difference. But things were to change. We did Operation Last Day Kulang, which was the next one, and that was unlike the Silicon one, which was south of Sangin in what's called the Upper Gereshk Valley. This was north of Sangin in the Upper Sangin Valley. And we did a long road move through the desert to get there from Camp Bastion. Took a very long time. And very eventful as well. I think a couple of the terrain was very difficult. A couple of vehicles flipped in as part of that from other call signs in what eventually became a sort of a 70 vehicle packet, an enormous convoy going through the desert. And there are a few occasions as part of it where my platoon was at the very front, and I was in the point vehicle, trying to select a route. Well, I remember during one of the stops, I think it was for a flipped Wimmick or maybe an Estonian vehicle. It's lost me now. Other elements went ahead, and when everything was sorted, we sort of had to catch up. So I had a sort of a conflicting pressure to catch up on one hand and keep ploughing an original route on the other hand, just in case Taliban had opted to lay a device where Brits had already been, even though it hadn't been much time. And at one point, I remember doing a wadi crossing, getting across a dry riverbed, and came onto this next plateau, and there just seemed to be tracks everywhere, as if a whole load of vehicles had sort of reorientated or something, and there were tracks all over the place. And sort of not sensing that I had the time to go back over the wadi and then go miles over to the right and find something else entirely, I sort of chose the least worst option and sort of went forward. Very unfortunately, at that point, after a few minutes, the Royal Marines that were crewing these sort of two-part Viking armored vehicles that we were being carried in went, stop, stop, stop. And the vehicle stopped, and he went, fucking hell, contact ID, wait out. And I looked in the, this vehicle, for me, I was the commander sitting inside on the right, and for me there was a driver's side window. Obviously it was left-hand drive, so it's on my right, with a wing mirror. I could look back and see, 4 vehicles back, big diagonal black column coming out from one of the vehicles. And I was like, no, my heart absolutely sank, because I knew that was A, one of A companies, B, it was the company command vehicle, and C, and I'd led us on that route. Everyone was following me directly on my tracks. So a lot, we stopped, had to ask some of our soldiers to grab metal detectors and make their way back to the mine strike location. It was devastating turn of events, really, because at that point we realized we'd lost, sustained the second fatality of the tour for A company, which was the company's signals deck commander, really beloved full corporal that everyone liked, including me. He was one of those great people that was a bit of an ally as I was bedding in. You need someone to have a bit of a joke with. Really hilarious bloke. And he'd been killed outright by this event. We had to stop and secure a safe place for a Chinook to land. In the back with him was an interpreter, an attached officer from another regiment, from the Gibraltar Regiment, as I remember it. And they were shaken up, but okay. But sadly, we had sustained that fatality, and the most bizarre thing, then it started raining for, I think, one of two times on the tour. It started raining. We just sat there in the middle of the desert, and I just remember feeling absolutely empty. Pretty miserable experience. And then, the show has to go on. We still had to make the assembly area, and we headed off. I believe we made it to the assembly area at sort of towards the last light. I remember seeing the reconnaissance cars in the distance and thinking, yeah, good. We've made it this far. Linked up with them, spent the night near some of the Estonian troops and prepared to conduct our offensive operations in the morning. It was all a bit of a blur after that, really. We went into various small towns, Pute, Lower Malazi, sporadic contact, but we were finding at that point that the Taliban didn't really want to fight us in the close confines if they could avoid it, because they knew that we were carrying so much in the way of HE grenades, anti-tank mines, which are bar-shaped and known as bar mines, that we would use to blow holes in walls that we needed to get through. You don't always want to use the door in these situations because you don't know who's waiting for you. So we take an indirect route, explosive method of entry. We spent a few more days out there in Pute, Lower Malazi, and went almost up towards Kajaki. Cleared some compounds, did some interesting things, and eventually, it was deemed the right time to collapse the operation. We didn't, the battle group had achieved its objectives, and we got new orders to recover. And then, interestingly, at that point, it was decided that 2 and 3 platoon would go back to Camp Bastion, refit, rest, and then come back out. A company were going to go to Sangin. We already knew that after the operation. And at that point, we were told as 1 platoon that we would go directly to Sangin now, or later that evening, linking up with battle group headquarters on the way through, then go directly to Sangin to support A Company 1WFR, Worcestershire Foresters, A Grenadier Company. Yeah. So we went there and began the best part of a week patrolling with them. We did some quick reaction force stuff for them before A Company, the remainder of A Company, the main body, came out and relieved A Company 1WFR in place. And then Sangin was ours for the next 4 months. And we had a great deal more company level operations to conduct there, patrolling Sangin every day, and getting to know the ground. Sangin was a much bigger town than Nauzad. It had been historically, like I said, a sort of a key opium training point. British forces have been under siege in Sangin district centre for the preceding summers. So we had hoped that the recent offensive operations kind of put the British on the front foot in the area. And it kind of did. We patrolled very aggressively, and we started going out in no less than 2 platoon strength, not necessarily 2 platoons together. There will always be 2 on the ground, to make sure we had that depth and that mutual support should anything happen. The company operations were very tough. We used to push north of Sangin DC, up through a sort of cluster of villages known as Jujale and a key crossing point that the Taliban used to use, the Nimshir crossing point. And we had lots of fights around there. But it was much more. It was very different to Nauzad in that we saw a lot more of the local nationals, a lot more. You know, Nauzad was a ghost town in the district centre. You had to go all the way, kilometres away to where the Taliban were to see anybody. Occasionally you'd see people coming back to their old houses, but rarely. Whereas in Sangin, it was populated. The shop fronts weren't open. They were by the time we left, which is something we're very proud of. That summer, security seemed to have returned in some form to Sangin. And we had a chance to run a lot of, as a company group, a lot of, what would be called hearts and minds stuff in sort of Vietnam era speak, influence operations, non-kinetic stuff to gain support with the local nationals.
What sort of thing would that be, Nick?
So there was a number of things that were done. I remember on one of the company operations, we helped a bunch of farmers with their irrigation. So, sort of an inlet from the river into the irrigation ditches was improved, so we stopped where we were. We spoke to local nationals there. My company commander said, well, look, if we use a tannoy and get the word out, could you assemble a workforce that we can pay some money to dig this, and we'll bring a light wheel tractor up, sort of a JCB, and do some good work. So some infrastructure work was done there, which was very good. I'm sure we were involved in some improvements to a school, which was right by the DC base. We used to do lots of visits to the local clinic, and we every so often there was this thing called the MedCap, where an American Black Hawk would fly in with a bunch of American doctors, and we'd put out security, and they would do a clinic at the back gate of our camp, which was the only time that we could look after non-battle local casualties and the sick. So they would come and see that, get all sorts of painkillers and that sort of thing. I used to feel very sorry for the old out there, because it's here it's kind of accepted that if you're quite old in the UK, you've probably got a few tubs of different painkillers that you use. Obviously access to that sort of thing out there is a lot harder. So, the old guys used to come along for pain pills and stuff, and I think things would be diagnosed.
How did people react?
They would play it very cool, I would say, both in those instances and what were called shuras, where we'd meet local leaders and have a bit of a powwow, and the company commander would sit cross-legged on the floor with some of his command team. People would be very honest that that they needed security and whatever projects that they would mention, so, but I think they had to be quite careful not to be seen as collaborators at the same time. I think the sort of the unwritten, the unspoken conversation was, if you want to be our best friends, you need to sort of guarantee that, you need to provide such security that the Taliban are irrelevant here or don't have access to us. And that's a very difficult thing to do for a single rifle company in a big town like Sangin. I remember being very surprised when, the Taliban would aggressively patrol, in my opinion, from what we saw, they would patrol very aggressively to make sure, no matter how well we did as the Brits, that they were there and they were visible and they had influence. So, I recall, my good friend, the 3 Platoon Commander, was just flying off on leave, and we'd gone off on a company operation, an overnight patrol to the south, and it was September time, so the maize crop had come up. So we were going through a maze of corn, maze of maize, and it was about 10 feet high, going through little alleyways. Nightmare for navigation. I had my compass out the whole time, which is not a good look, but just trying to keep on heading and realize where we were. And quite quickly, only about 600 meters south of camp, my 2 section, which was on a parallel course on my right, was slightly ahead at that point, came under fire, engaged. I think 2 platoon at a similar time starting engaging someone who was posing as an Afghan policeman and had opened fire at them whilst talking to another local national. And that went on for a few minutes. And I, was with, I believe, 1 section, and we moved pretty fast. With 3 section, moved pretty fast. I sort of got to the front and, tried to navigate us to a position where we could support. And we came to a T-junction in this maze. And I remember putting my back against this wall and trying to send a 6-figure grid reference to everybody about where we were, because of the navigational difficulties, it was becoming difficult to understand where we all were in relation to each other, and blue on blue sort of fratricide was a risk. So I wanted to be very careful. I remember one of the lance corporals, section 2nd in command, saying, "Boss, there's some movement in the crops." And at that point, a guy in sort of black fatigues, wearing a chest rig with a AK variant weapon and a Motorola radio, stepped out and was very quickly shot by a machine gunner in my platoon, which was a unbelievable thing to sort of experience. And the fire started so quickly. I thought, someone's had a negligent discharge that fired their weapon by mistake. But no, they were engaging this guy who'd come out of the crops very close by, and this guy was wet through. So I think he was the guy that had been engaged by 2 section, or one of the guys engaged by 2 section over on the right, and had got in an irrigation ditch and run round and was trying to get behind them, or something like that. Very brave, actually, and had run into us. And why was this guy in military style black fatigues? Linking back to that influence and relevance point. I think they were trying to show a visible militaristic presence in the area to counter the successes that we were having. It's like, so as to say to them, don't underestimate our reach. We're 600 meters away from the British camp, moving with impunity. Don't forget who we are. That was my personal read on the situation. So it was a battle for influence in Sangin. They couldn't do what we did in terms of infrastructure and support and of all kinds, and engagement with. Well, they would certainly engage with leaders. You always got the sense that perhaps public figures and Afghan National Security Forces officials might be talking both ways, and it's kind of understandable, because they knew that we wouldn't stay there forever, and that's all. That wheels come full circle now, but they were going to stay relevant if they could possibly help it. Sangin was worth a lot to them, and they were prepared to fight for it.
when the tour ended and you head back home, what was that like, that transition from what is obviously a very busy environment, probably quite chaotic at times, but certainly very kinetic, to use that word. And then you're back. The reason why I think of that is because when we first talked about this, you were walking to a school to collect your daughter, I think. And I just was really struck by the sort of, you talk about being in a war whilst walking to collect your school. So walking to the school to collect your daughter. And I think that's almost like a vignette of what it must have been like coming home after you'd been deployed. How did you cope with that?
It was peculiar, definitely. I mean, one thing that's worth remembering is that it's always kind of okay because you're together. The team that you went away with still exists. We all went back to camp together. We had some decompression in Cyprus, which basically involved, I think, a few slabs of beer and a stand-up comedian, and backs turned on us, really. And then, got home fairly quickly. We were allowed to go home. Some people's family were waiting. Unlike some of the other companies, you came home to sort of roaring reception. A company arrived home in the middle of the night, and there were just a few spouses waiting for the bus and that sort of thing. My girlfriend, now wife, was traveling, which I'd positively encouraged because, didn't quite like the idea of her just sort of waiting around for me. And she had an idea. I was like, yeah, please do it. And we kept up over satellite phone occasionally and letters and all the rest. And it's kind of, went home to see my family in Colchester, which felt very peculiar. My brother had just had a baby, and my mum had just bought a dog, so home was different. And this dog looked exactly like this dog that we had adopted in Sangin, so it was quite weird. I was like, oh, why is Panther here? But it was Mum's new dog. But anyway, went to the pub with my brother, and people are always asking, what's it like to be home? It's kind of an expansive question. It takes you a while to decompress, but I felt pretty level. I felt very lucky. There were things to be sad about, of course. The company had lost 2 people. The regiment, the battalion, had lost 9, and I think the wider battle group had lost 11. So the toll was high, and there were lots of moments to reflect. I particularly remember some of the freedom parades we did around the place in Guildford, Bury St Edmunds, Norfolk, and that sort of thing. I remember finishing in Norfolk Cathedral one day, and someone sang a beautiful song, someone from the regimental family, and there was a very touching sermon given about a friend looking for his pal in no man's land in World War One, and times like that when it was that were purposely designed for reflection, could tend to catch me out a bit. But other than feeling a bit weird and uncomfortable walking around England, it was okay. It was good to see everyone. And, the guys seemed all right, primarily. I came home buzzing because I remember waiting for our inevitably heavily delayed flights out of Bastion and then out of Kandahar. The guys had there was always a sort of a TV to watch in the big bases, and they were playing some card game where they were wrapping each other's knuckles as forfeits and that sort of thing, and everyone just seemed happy to be amongst each other. The night before we flew out of Bastion, and it was like really, the tour felt like it was over. I got several complaints that the lads were having too much fun in one of the tents in Camp Bastion, and could you go and ask them to quiet down? And of course I did, but I thought, I almost don't want to, because they deserve it. They deserved everything. They just got on with these tasks, which were unbelievably tiring. The exertion was incredible on these long patrols, incredible heat. I think 53 was the highest temperature we experienced or something up in Sangin. And the quiet grit that they had will stay with me forever. I just can't believe what we asked of them. I think that's the big reflection, and they just got on with it like it was cool. Occasionally people would have a moment, doubts would arise based on business going on from home. And I think I said to you before, I'd come to war thinking the world at home would politely stop for us while we got on with our adventure. But of course, people die in their family. There are still divorces, deaths, births, lawsuits, and all sorts of things going on back home. And that really does affect everybody, and there would be times where people's heads would drop and you could see the change in performance. I do remember one particular guy was being defrauded by a close family member and didn't want to say. And it took a few evenings sort of sitting with him and giving him cigarettes and saying, what's going on, before he was able to share his story. And thankfully we were able to speak to his bank on the satellite phone and get them to sort of freeze his account. Sort of promised that we would make things right if they could stop charging him on his overdraft, if they could just wait until we came back. And I sort of gave him some insights to what we were doing. I made sure it was a noisy day with some test firing going on just for flavor. But it was, things like that, the home pressures are relevant. Mm. If people have a sense that if people have a sense that they're well, I guess any of that stuff is going to erode their sense of purpose on task, and it's going to sap their energy. And we did see that sometimes. So that was something we try and pounce on, because, thinking more practically, not only do you sort of adore these soldiers, but they, it's bad for combat effectiveness ultimately to have people being hangdog who can't quite pay attention if they're under pressure that they don't deserve to be under. So that was something we would always look out for.
Many people have said to me, actually, on different episodes and not just on the podcast, about the simplicity of war and what it is that you've got to do. It's very clear. And I think what you're talking about there is kind of the complexity of life back at home and ultimately civilian life. It's a very, very different world, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there is a simplicity to it. And it's very happy existence in a way. Living with a company, you all know each other incredibly well. You've all got very clear direction. You know what you need to do day to day. By and large, the food's there, and everything's going well. We also had a canal running through our Sangin camp that we could swim in. It was pretty cool. It was a good place to be. Yeah, and it kind of all the sort of home stuff can feel a bit almost unwelcome, and then it sort of comes in and it catches people, and then they realize, oh yeah, I actually care a great deal about what's going on at home. I have known people that just have stayed off comms with home during these things, and in a way I can see why. It is a test to let the wider world back in. But one thing that must be said is that by and large, the regimental family were hugely supportive. We got bundles of care packages and stuff like that from family, from well-wishers, sometimes more than could be flown out to us. And when we got home, the reception we got from the people of East Anglia was incredible. It's one of the most moving things I've ever seen. It was when the chips were down, Britain was supportive, and especially the geography that we recruited from out in East Anglia. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. So, yeah, it was a very moving thing to experience, for sure.
It's obvious that you care about your soldiers. I mean, that comes across really strongly in the way you're speaking and what you're talking about. Are you still in touch with any of them?
Yeah, I have a WhatsApp with the rifle platoon. Most of us are on there. some are not. Sometimes people want to break from it. Sometimes people get in touch with me one-to-one. Sometimes I see people on the commuter train, sometimes in the street, because, the battalion were very close, were based where I live now or just down the road previously. So yeah, we do stay in touch. We've only had one reunion in all the time what would it be now, 17 years. So we need to do another. It's ever so hard to arrange, but we'll do it again. And by and large, people are doing well. We've lost a couple of the guys on subsequent tours. Very sadly, one suicide, and I'm glad that we were connected when that happened. Very, very grateful for the modern technology. It's easy for us to stay close. I mean, I can't imagine after World War II, when all you had was letters, it must have been so easy to drift apart. We could, if we really put our mind to it, have a reunion next month. It's just finding the right time for everybody. But yeah, we stay in touch. We have jokes. We trade advice. We ask after each other's families and that sort of thing. There's not always much traffic on it, but we all know that we're there, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, and like I said, it is very clear that you cared and still care very much about your platoon. That just leads me to say thank you very much, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Steve. I really enjoyed it. Good to speak to you.
Tip, I thought that was a fascinating insight into the life of an infantry commander in Helmand Province. I think it certainly talked about things I'd not thought about before.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Nick's told us there is just that it's a bit of a template of operations in Helmand, especially in Sangin and Nauzad, from what I never operated there, but a lot of my colleagues have. And but for him, as a platoon commander, troop commander, platoon commander, for him to have that as his first evolution as such after his pre-training that they're deploying is unbelievable, and you can see how that's completely welded in his head, and that commitment he has shown to those people that he served with, and how it continues to today. That quite a few years, 12 years after the operations actually happened. It's good, listening to this story as well. It goes through a few things, because I'm obviously not with it from an army background, but I love the history by each of the companies named after a battle honour, so that they're carrying on the legacy of like former veterans from their battalion, from the Royal Anglian Regiment, and I love that, and I think in a way that is why the British forces and the British Army are quite the envy of a lot of countries around the world. And then when he introduced his platoon, you could see how passionate he was about all his people. And I, as from my experience in the service, that's the starting point. If you've got that, and you're able to sort of judge or measure your command team, your troop, your platoon sergeant, and your platoon section commanders, and you've got them, you're happy with them, and you've got a good, strong team, that as a new to the army platoon commander is exceptional for your education and your confidence and in your people. You need that, because I have seen young troop commanders or platoon commanders that haven't had that support, and it makes them struggle, but it also gives them a bit of a warped appreciation of who their people are. So it's really important, to have that good bond for a new young platoon commander or troop commander. And he said, which is brilliant, I love it when he said, how much he valued his junior NCOs and their experience. My life as a Royal Marine, a corporal is, or it was, the Corps has moved on, I'm no longer in the Royal Marines, but the corporal was the most important rank in the Royal Marines. They're the ones and I'd say the most enjoyable, for me, without a shadow of a doubt. The corporal is the one who lives and breathes with the front end of the tip of the spear of the commander unit or the battalion or the battle group or whatever it is. the corporal is the one there. The corporal's the one that will obviously put the flag with his section on the ground when it's taken from the enemy type thing. You know, they're the pinnacle of it, but they have to live, breathe, educate, fight, father, look after, socialise with all their men. And nobody else does that. The seniors, you know, historically and traditionally, the seniors won't mix with the corporals, the officers with the seniors and all that. It's all a professional sort of setting from there. But from the start, the corporals and the Marines or the privates, they have to live and breathe and fight together. And that's the importance of that role. If you've got good junior NCOs, your ability to give mission command and entrust them with carrying out tasks is enforced, and you can do it. You can do that because sometimes if you haven't got that confidence in your junior NCOs, you're going to have to get yourself in the weeds where you're not required as a young troop commander or platoon commander. But I like the fact is that he appreciates the importance and the value of having good, strong section commanders and junior NCOs.
And I think that tells its own story as well, doesn't it? Because I think, as you've already alluded to, the relationship he built with his platoon and the teams within that platoon, I think and how he is still in touch with them to this day and probably still helping them out, I imagine, from time to time by the way he was speaking. And that, as you said, was a seminal moment in his life, wasn't it? You can just tell by the way he's talking about it, sort of how profound that was for him.
Yeah, I think, along with command, leadership is the important thing. And I think as a young platoon or troop commander, it's hard to sort of stamp your authority and be a leader initially when you're so under the experience level to a lot of people that you're in command of. So you have to sort of be very, I'd say, savvy, but also be a very good people person to get through that and bring yourself up to be that commander who is a proper leader, who's able to lead. And leadership, I think, is so important in command. And I think it goes across the board, not only in military life, but I'd say in corporate life and in family life and everything, that sort of thing. Because you're a dad doesn't mean to say, or a mum, you're like, you've got a command position, but you've got to lead and mentor and do everything that parents have to do. And I think, even though I don't live like a military robot, but you've got to understand that a lot of things you do in the military does cross-pollinate into life and society and family life and everything. So there's meaning behind it all. But he gets it, understands that he had a good team to bring him over those initial steps of being an officer in the army. Mm-hmm. And I think that put him in good stead for the rest of his career. And like I say, he had a point, he said he had to leave or wanted to move on. But up until that point in time, his progression was very positive, career-wise.
And that's about building trust and relationships with your team as well, isn't it? That they actually respect the decisions you're making and I guess understand to a degree what decisions you're making as a leader.
Well, decisions, but you have to also inform those decisions of the leader, because a lot of times, in a lot of cases, the troop sergeant and your section corporals will have a lot of experience, especially at this time in his career, of warfighting. Potentially, they could have already done tour before with a different battalion or whatever. So, they've got to assist and inform your decisions. Obviously, a lot of them are time sensitive, got to happen. So you're trained to take that leadership, to make those command decisions. But if you've got time, then you take informed decisions. You use, things like section average or whatever. You ask your team, what would you best to do? You hold the executive, but again, listening to these capable, and loyal individuals is very important, I think, because if you don't, that's a bit of a, it's a warped leadership, I think, if you're not able, it's a two-way process rather than just it's my way or the highway type thing.
I'm obviously no expert in this because I haven't served, but it sounds like when you don't have that, when you don't show those qualities or have those qualities, it's also potentially a recipe for disaster because it could go quite wrong, couldn't it?
It could do. But then again, the command and the leadership, obviously, the leadership is already happening throughout whatever organisation you're in. So really, there should be audits or at points at which where you'll be sort of like should we say restraint from making bad decisions, or or even get sacked. You know what I mean? And this I have seen on operations as well. But that shouldn't, if you create a signed team and become part of that signed team and lead it and command it, it's all part of that progression. But it's the team that'll make they'll win in the end or lose, but they'll also take the highs and the lows, the hits, the casualties, the losses, but obviously the wins. And and that camaraderie and bond that you'll have with those people is eternal. And that's something that we hit on all the time. That'll happen.
Yeah. And then he moved to Sangin, didn't he? And apparently they've got a little canal for bathing in. I was a bit surprised by that.
Yeah, I think but the way he talked through like Nauzad and Sangin, and for a lot of my friends that are listening to this, everyone's that I know been in Sangin, have been in that canal and had been refreshed. Probably not the healthiest canal this side of the Pegos Ridge, but it's still, I think every person served in Sangin has been there in between having extremely hard, kinetic battles with the enemy. And, quite a lot of casualties there as well and losses. But that's why it was great listening to, to Nick telling his story, because the grind he's been on is grind and paths that so many of my colleagues have been on that I haven't been there myself, but you can feel it, and you can feel the footsteps that all our people that have served or have done, and how harsh it has been, across the board.
And of course, so many of our listeners will have probably been to Sangin, as you've said, and so will have had similar experiences and learned similar things.
Yeah, yeah. And even the sphere, the spectrum of his tour, coming towards the end, he got involved with more, the Shuras and communicating and engaging with the enemy and a sort of mentoring approach as well. And dealing with the Shuras, that especially you think of his early days on the tour are in a kinetic battle. And then when it comes to his later days, he's in Shuras looking at people with the doubt of friend or foe.
Yeah.
What can I do? Keep your professionalism. How do I run this? I mean, you can see what's going through his head at the time and what he has to deal with.
So, Tip, what exactly is a Shura? Because not everybody who has served would have been involved in these. What's the process? What's the objective?
Well, a Shura is it's an Afghan culture anyway, and I think it goes across a lot of that region. It's not only Afghanistan where you have a meeting and it'll be with the village elder, the local area, the county elder, the province elder that will hold a Shura, and it's meant to be a safe environment where you come in. You make sure a drink or tea or sweets or food. Obviously, you have to be very compliant with the ritual as such. The way that it's done with the culture. And I think all the Shuras I was involved in and people that I know were involved in it, they respected this, and we've done this. This is important because it's such an important facet or part of Afghan life as a Shura, and the agreements made in that are basically the bonds made in blood. Sometimes, potentially, I mean, these bonds may be broken, or maybe there's a misdirection in translation or something. I don't know, but it's held traditionally. They're really held in high things. So the importance of a Shura when you're called to it is, again, first off, you do have a bit of a security dilemma, but it's the importance of getting in there and leaning into the tribal culture of whether it be Pashtun or any of the other tribes in Afghanistan.
So a lot of important decisions are probably made and arrangements made as a result of this.
Definitely. And in fact, I'd say, and a lot of things, even up the political chain, that happens before it gets into Parliament. That'll happen in provincial and county level and village level and even small hamlets. But it's the way business is done.
Mm. And again, that takes us back to the theme that's kind of been recurring through quite a lot of these episodes around understanding Afghan culture and how important that is.
Yeah, I mean, the Afghan culture, for me, I mean, it's like, say, we're human beings. Culturally, everyone has a cultural cloak that they wear and what they belong to. And that's theirs. That's the way it happens. So when you're on their turf, as far as I'm concerned, that's exactly what we do. You know, we tune into it. We've got missions, we've got things that we have to achieve, but we have to be, you know, compliant, and we have to listen to the people who are meant to be supporting, because we want to make a better life for them. I mean, you did say to him as well about the simplicity of war, or the simple life in war, and this has sort of resonated quite a few of the, you know, the things we spoke about, and there is a simplicity in war, and obviously with the, you know, there is times where it's so mundane, and then you'll have times where it's, you know, the intensity is just, you know, off the Richter scale. So, you know, you're living this highs and lows with, you know, at times it can be traumatic, you know, loss as well. And it does become addictive in a way, because that's your sole purpose in life. That's everything, whether you're a father, a brother, you know, wherever, or a sister of somebody who are back home. You know, I mean, everything that matters is in front of you or beside you, the people you're operating with. That's it. That's the day-to-day existence, and that's the important thing. And it can be life or death. Everything that's back home, you know, any of those issues that creep forward and mess around with your sort of psyche when you're on the ground, that can be dangerous as well. So really, you got to keep focused on, like you say, what's in front of you, what matters, and the people beside you. You know what I mean? And that's the way it goes. And I think one of the last things he does sort of hit on as well, which I think every person, because this is from what, you know, what Nick's given us is the steady state. This is an archetypical tour, I'd say, for Sangin, of a rifle company in an army battalion or a commando unit, or, you know, a para battalion. This is it. This is the day in, day out. This is it. You know, the arduous nature will rise and fall, but this gives you the steady. This is it, and the loss and how it's felt. Now, he does mention that one of his guys he's lost was through suicide. I personally have had many friends and colleagues that have taken their own lives since coming back from operations. And I think everyone will feel that. And I'm so glad that Nick mentioned it, because it is so prevalent and it's ongoing, and it may even escalate in the prevalence as such.
Yeah, it's a terrible challenge that's facing those that have served, isn't it? The community as a whole. And I think if you or anybody else can help your oppo when they're feeling like that, or in that dark place, if you can spot it, do what you can. And we've said this in other episodes. I think it's, if you are feeling like that, please reach out for help. Talk to someone, anyone, and I'm sure that, you know, they'll be able to help you on your journey of recovery. Yeah,
I mean, and that's, you know, thanks, Nick, for highlighting that in this chat as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Before you go, if you're a member of the Armed Forces community and need support with your mental health, Op Courage can help. Use the link in this podcast description for details. Or you can phone the Combat Stress Helpline on 0800 138 1619. If you'd like to contact us, email studio@companyofmakers.com.
Finally, we're giving a really big shout out to our funders. They support all the activities that we provide for the well-being of those who've served. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines Charity, Greenwich Hospital, Arts Council England, and the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Thank you.
This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Tip Cullen and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.